Welcome to Sengoku Daimyo's Chronicles of Japan. My name is Joshua, and this is episode 141, Temmu's New Year's Traditions. The chill winter air meant that most of the assembled crowd had donned multiple layers of robes. Men and women had assembled together upon the open, rock-covered courtyard, both to see and to be seen. The north and east of the courtyard were the walls and gates of the buildings that made up the royal palace, the roofs of the buildings just visible beyond the gates. The onlookers stood arrayed around the open lanes that had been created for the event. At one end of the rocky field were targets, while at the other were the archers, also arrayed in their finest outfits. While technically they wore hunting robes, cut to allow greater movement in the arm, many of these fabrics had no business being anywhere near a moor or the dirt of open fields. After all, this wasn't just some hunt. They were demonstrating their skills in the center of the state. At the official's command, the archers loosed their arrows. The crowd murmured at the soft crack of the bowstring, the faint whisper of arrows as fletchings cut through the air, and the thud as they struck their targets. Looking downrange, approval bubbled through the crowd. The targets were well struck. Beyond the archers on the field, another group awaited their turn. The events of the day would be the talk of the court, from the lowest clerk to the highest prince, for days to come. Not just the well-placed shot, but also the grace and poise of the one who had let loose an arrow of particular note. And heaven forbid an arrow miss its target. Even kicking up stones or scraping the earth could have negative social consequences. Every piece of an outfit would be scrutinized, every movement talked about. A particularly good showing could inspire poetry, and beyond the prizes being offered to the winner, could also bring notice to those from more obscure backgrounds. The new year had just started, and a good performance might be just what was needed to help put the rest of the year on a wonderful footing. Welcome back. This is the first episode of the new year, 2026, and we are still going through the reign of Owama, aka Temmu Tenno, covering the period from 672 to 686. Before we get started, though, quick shout out to Suzuki for supporting us over on Patreon. It means a lot and really helps us keep this thing going. If you would like to support us or our efforts to maintain the website, where we also have the armor manual, clothing, and a miscellany on various topics, we have information over at sengokudaimyo.com, and we'll have more information at the end of this and every episode. Support is always appreciated, as I really do want to try and minimize ads. I don't put any into the podcast myself, though some platforms may place ads around the podcast, which I cannot always control. All right, now we've covered a lot this reign, but this episode we are going to cover three things in particular. First off, and perhaps a bit of a tangent, we'll talk about some of the issues with the Chronicles when it comes to reading, especially reading it in translation. It seems quite clear to me that even the sources that the chroniclers were using weren't always in agreement with each other on how they spelled certain things, or even improperly recording when things happened. After that, we'll cover the major topics of this episode, focusing primarily on the New Year's traditions of the court. We'll look at the major events of the first month for each year in the reign, allowing us to see some of the similarities, as well as the differences. Finally, we'll look at the last year of Owama's reign, particularly as he grew ill, because it can be a fascinating question. What did people do when disease struck before we had modern medicine, especially when that disease struck the head of state? Here, the Chronicles reveal a lot, not only about the beliefs of the time, but about their syncretism, how people were willing to reach out to whatever power they could in order to try to cure things like disease. Whether it was yin-yang divination, beseeching the local kami, or attempting to make merit, all of these things were on the table when it came to illness and mortality. So, let's get into it. All right, so one of the things I wanted to talk about is the problem that we have in trying to read the Chronicles, both in the way they are written and then the translation issue on top of that. Even in Japanese, the Chronicles have to be translated out of an ancient form of kanbun, basically a Japanese version of Chinese that is using Sinitic characters often in their continental forms in the way that they would have been used over in what is today China, but still with a very Japanese flair. Like any document written by non-native speakers, the Chronicles have their idiosyncrasies that make it different from what someone in Chang'an might be writing at the very same time. There are times and places where it is clear that something is meant to be read in the Japanese pronunciation, which itself was different from modern Japanese. Add to this the fact that there are many times that different Sinitic characters sound very similar in Japanese, especially in modern Japanese. So any English translation of the Chronicles, which doesn't give the actual characters in the source text, just add to that confusion. It's really why I like to consult either the Japanese Historical Text Initiative or an electronic version of the National History Series text, though even those have issues at times when the characters used in the text don't exist in modern character sets, though that seems to be less and less of a problem. One example I want to give of the complexities of reading the Chronicles and the need to dive deeper into the original language and consult multiple versions is a set of records for Kino Omi no Abemaro and others of the Ki family. Now, Abemaro is the first mention of a member of the Ki family in this part of the Chronicles. On the 9th day of the 8th month of 673, that is the first year since Oama's ascension, and 1 year after the Jinshin no Ran, we are told that Kino Omi no Abemaro and others were given favors and rewards for their service during the war in Iga province. Indeed, Kino Omi no Abemaro is listed prominently in the records of the Jinshin no Ran and appears to have been one of the generals for Oama and the Yoshino faction. Less than a year later, on the 28th day of the second month, Kino Omi no Abemaro died and was posthumously awarded the rank of Daishi, which was fifth from the top in the old system of 26 ranks. Rather respectable rank, to be sure. Later that same year, we get a note that Kino Omi no Katamaro, another member of the family apparently, was appointed along with a Prince Mino as a commissioner for the erection of the Great Temple of Takechi, later known as Daikon Daiji. 2 years later, however, we get a record on the 22nd day of the 4th month of 676 that the sovereign Oama sent an order to the governor of Mino telling him to let the children of Kino Omi no Abemaro, resident in the district of Toki, be removed to the east country and become peasants over in that country. On the face of it, this appears to be an incredible fall from grace. Kino Omi no Abemaro is basically one of the top generals and heroes of the Jinshin no Ran, but his children are so unruly that they are banished to the east and stripped of their noble status? There has got to be a story there, right? Then in 679, on the 3rd day of the 2nd month, we are told that Kino Omi no Katamaro died, and for his service in the Jinshin War, he received the posthumous rank of Upper Daikin. That would have been roughly the 7th rank, 2 below Kino Abemaro. So was the Ki family back in the good graces of the court? What is going on here? First off, when we get to the original text, we see that Aston, whose translation of the Nihon Shoki we've been working on, has made an apparent error in translation. Remember, Aston was translating the Chronicles back in 1896 without the aid of modern computers, along with a lot of other research that has happened since then, and I can hardly fault him for missing things here and there. This is why, if you cannot check the original, you may also want to look at the new translation from John Bentley. Here we can see that he translates the name not as Kino Omi no Abemaro, but rather as Kino Omi no Kasamaro. And if we compare Kino Omi no Kasamaro with the previous entry on Kino Omi no Katamaro, we can see that these are actually the exact same names except for a single character. Leads us to the question. Are these the same person and the scribe simply miswrote one of the characters in the name? It may not even be on the chroniclers so much as whatever text they were working on themselves. This isn't helped by the fact that we later on see another entry for Kino Katamaro, but that one uses the character for kata meaning hard, using the kunyomi or Japanese reading, rather than using two phonetic characters in the onyomi reading. So is this just another way to write the same katamaro, or is this yet another person altogether? Ultimately, we can't be entirely sure, It does seem wild that there would be two ki no omi no katamaro at court at the same time, and nobody otherwise distinguished the two. The question about kasamaro and katamaro and whose kids were sent into exile is a bit harder to untangle. Truth be told, it is ultimately a minor point for us. I mean, probably not for them at the time, but for now, yeah. We have only a couple of lines here, and maybe these passages will help illuminate something later in the histories, but for now, they're just fragments of the story of what was happening. Parts of the tattered tapestry from which the royal history was ripped out and restitched together. The rest of the story then largely discarded, unless it made its way to us through other means. The Chronicles may be flawed, but they are still our main source for the period. And while we might challenge individual items, we still get a glimpse at how things operated back at this time. For instance, if we look at the events happening around the New Year, we can see some common threads. The New Year is, of course, an important tradition in many cultures. Whether it was a solar or lunar cycle, or some combination, the New Year indicated a new cycle and was often accompanied by associated symbols and rituals. Today in the US, it is often celebrated with fireworks and champagne, followed by making resolutions for the new year. In Japan, people will often go to their local shrine or temple for an important first visit, and temple bells will ring out 108 times. Yet another tradition is the osechi ryori, the traditional New Year's foods. This has grown over time from a tradition of eating a large bowl of rice to various other foods that are seen as auspicious or having special properties, such as the hardening of teeth, a major concern before the era of modern dental hygiene. Then there are traditions such as kagami biraki, or opening of the mirror, and the creation of special mochi or rice cakes for this purpose. Of course, all these traditions started somewhere and have evolved over time, so what do we know about the New Year celebrations during the late 7th century? One caveat, in the Chronicles, we only really see what was happening in the court and the Yamato court at that. There may have been local traditions that others were following that, unless we find documentation about them, we likely would never know. But many of the court traditions were passed down to later generations. These traditions appear to include the giving of gifts, large celebratory banquets, and the annual archery tournament. Banquets are some of the first and most common things we see. We see a banquet as Owama assumes the throne in 673, which probably was the event that overshadowed anything else that they might have done that year. The following year, 674, there doesn't seem to have been much recorded, and I wonder if they were still pulling everything together after the turmoil of Owama's ascension. And so it is that the first month of 675, we really get to see the annual New Year's events in their full form. On the second day of that year, from the royal princes on down, all of the public functionaries presented their respects to the sovereign. I suspect that this was a large ceremony where everyone gathered in the courtyard of the palace together, or something similar, not that each person individually went up and presented their respects. I doubt Owama would have wanted to sit through all of that, for one thing. Also, as we've already seen, there were limits on what parts of the palace different functionaries were allowed to enter, so some of these well-wishers may have been outside, others in the courtyard, and others in the palace building itself, depending on their rank and importance in the bureaucratic hierarchy. On the following day, all public functionaries from the initial rank upwards presented firewood. Aston notes that this is the first mention of what would become a yearly practice. Firewood may not seem like much, but it would have been important to keeping things running, especially given how early people were supposed to arrive at the palace and administrative complex each day. This wasn't firewood for a fireplace, they didn't have those, but probably would have been used either for cooking or, I suspect, for the large braziers that burned with wood and pitch to light the darkness, particularly in the winter months. Firewood could also be processed into smaller pieces of coal for other uses. It's interesting that for the first ceremony, the Chronicles describe the court from the royal princes on down, while for the giving of firewood, the order is from the initial, which is to say the lowest ranks, upwards. This could indicate the order in which things progressed in these cases, or may have just been a function of however it was written down and however the chroniclers decided to copy it. Several days after the firewood, on the 7th day of the first month, a banquet was given at court for the ministers, so only the high-ranking functionaries. 10 days later, on the 17th, everyone of rank, the ministers of state, the daibu or high officials, and all the public functionaries from the initial rank upwards, had an archery meeting in the court of the Western Gate. Archery and archery contests had been important to the Yamato people for ages, and same on the continent. Confucius, back in his day, suggested that archery was a martial skill that even nobles should cultivate. I believe we've noted before how archery could be used both for warfare and for just feeding your family. As such, it was considered a particularly useful skill for just about everyone to have. Probably also helped that it was a martial skill that noblemen and others could use to show off without actually risking any injury to themselves in the process. Just saying. And as we described at the top of the episode, this particular archery contest would, for both participants and spectators, likely have been a chance to show off the top of their game, whether in martial prowess, clothing, or behavior. And since we're looking at New Year's celebrations, let's keep this thing going and look at later years in Owama's reign. As I go through these, you'll start to see patterns where the events I've just described will generally recur year after year, but not identically, sometimes with a shuffle in the schedule, and sometimes we may not see them at all. In 676, for example, we see that the ministers and public functionaries pay their respects on the first day of the new year. On the fourth day, the sovereign granted gifts to the higher level officials, from Royal Prince Takechi down to the high officials or daibu of shokin rank. Their not-so-secret Santa gifts included robes, hakama, lined garments, obi for their waists, leg straps and staves, or walking sticks. We're also told that everyone above the rank of shokin also got an armrest thrown in as well. Further gifts or grants were given out several days later on the 7th to everyone from the rank of shokin on up, based on their individual circumstances. Then on the 15th, we again see all of the functionaries present firewood, and then they were all entertained at a court banquet. The following day, they held the annual New Year's archery contest with prizes at the court of the Western Gate. Those who hit the target received prizes of different values. In a footnote in his recent translation of the Nihon Shoki, Bentley references Kuroita on Article 41 of Miscellaneous Statutes, saying that this archery event was apparently a regular New Year's occurrence, and even the prizes were noted there. The same day they held the archery contest, that year, Owama held a banquet at Shima Palace. Shima was the name given to the Soga prime minister back in the day, so I assume this was at or near the site of the old Soga residence. In 677, by comparison, we don't see nearly as much reference. There is archery at the south gate, vice the west gate, but that is it. The festivities in 678 similarly only talk about the archery at the south gate. There's also mention of a preparation for worshipping the kami of heaven and earth, for which a purification was held throughout the state. In addition, an abstinence palace or saigu was erected on the bank of the Kurahashi River. Kurahashi appears to be a tributary of the Ohara River in Sakurai. And this feels less like a New Year's celebration and more of a sign of merit-making. The saigu would have likely been to prepare for a trip to Ise Shrine, and sure enough, 3 months later, Owama was preparing to go to the saigu, but that was when Princess Tochi suddenly died and they scuttled the plans. Now in 679, the court greeted the new year with a new decree. Owama declared that the princes, ministers, and public functionaries, that is, anyone in service to the government, basically, were to refrain from paying respects during New Year's or other ceremonies to anyone except relatives of the grade of elder brother, elder sister, and above, or to the senior members of the houses. Princes weren't even to pay respects to their own mothers unless they were themselves princesses. Ministers were likely not to pay respects to their mothers if they were of mean rank, in other words, if they were commoners. These kinds of statutes are pretty interesting. First of all, you have to ask yourself, why? Why are they doing this? In all likelihood, there were various local traditions and individuals paid respects to their parents as well as to others to whom they owed respect for one reason or another. Here the state is ordering society such that there is a clear hierarchy, at least among the members of the court. Since women often found advancement by marrying up, it was usual for one's mother to have been born a lower rank in society than oneself. And so we see them enforcing that social order. That new order was likely based on Confucian concepts of hierarchy, and this seems to go along with those same ideas. What we don't really see is how this was enforced, if at all. Now, the day after that proclamation, the yearly archery competition took place at the west gate of the palace. Now, the next year, 680, we see a New Year's banquet at the court of the Great Hall. Ōama himself occupied what is called the Mukai Kodono, which appears to refer to one of the smaller wings of the hall. Based on the palace layout, what we see in the postal remains, this probably means that he was set up in the smaller wing, likely in a more intimate space, while most of the other guests were in the largest space of the hall, maintaining that crucial separation of sovereign and subjects. This same year, 680, the New Year's archery event included princes of the blood all the way down to the rank of shoken, the very lowest rank in the court, and it was held at the south gate. You may be noticing a pattern that the archery competition is listed as being held at either the south or west gates. The south gate probably refers to the main gate of the later Okamoto, aka the Kiyomihara Palace. The west gate refers to the west gate of the Ebinoko enclosure. We talked about these and the initial layout of the palace back in episode 134, and you can check out that podcast blog post for some images of what things looked like as well. Now, these gates were on the north and east sides of a large, mostly rectangular courtyard, which was likely the event site. So it isn't as if these were separate areas, the south gate or west gate, just a difference of orientation and possibly where things were set up in what was otherwise the same relative space. It may also have just been how they recorded it at the time based on what people thought was important. The following year, 681, we see similar ceremonies. We see offerings made to the kami of heaven and earth, and we once again see a note about various functionaries paying their respects at court. Even though this wasn't mentioned every year, it could have been an annual thing and just wasn't always recorded, so the chroniclers just wrote down what they had records for. There are certainly other things we don't necessarily witness in the records, such as the annual promotions and promulgations. We see irregular promotions, of course, such as on someone's passing, but the regular administration of the government and promotions of people to new positions is not something we really see regularly documented, since it probably doesn't really shed much light on the sovereign and the royal household. It was probably just considered a normal thing, so why bother writing about it? And so we sometimes see things if they get mentioned, but otherwise we only catch glimpses. That would change as records became more administrative and the histories were more about simply recording what was happening, though still from a particular angle. At this point, however, we aren't dealing with a single court record, but rather with numerous records, stories, and recollections, all brought together by the chroniclers themselves. That same year, 681, we also see another banquet with Ōama situated once again in the Mukai no Kodono, while the princes of the blood and non-royal princes were both introduced into the inner reception chamber. Ministers attended in the outer reception chamber, and they all received sake and musical performances, and rank advancements were given out. Kusakabe no Ki no Ogata was graduated from the rank of upper daisen to lower daikin, and given the title of Naniwa no Muraji. A few days later, Sakaibe no Muraji no Iwazumi was granted a fief with 60 horses and received presents of coarse silk, floss silk, cloth, and 100 mattocks. My last one being a rather interesting gift, I have to admit. Of course, in true Chronicles fashion, we have no idea why these gifts were made. We don't even have another reference to Iwazumi around there, but he must have done something. We are later told that there was an annual archery shoot and then a decree possibly unrelated to New Year's that the various provinces were ordered to repair the shrines of the kami of heaven and earth. The year 682 is an anomaly. There's no mention of a banquet nor of an archery tournament. I do wonder if this may have to do with the sad events of that first month. While it started fine, Toneri no Miyatsuko no Nukamushi was raised from daisen to lower shokin. We are told that on the 18th day of the first month, Lady Higami, one of Ōama's consorts, died in the palace. Next day, there was an earthquake, and she was then buried on the 27th. Prominent illness and death may have put something of a pall on the annual ceremonies. That could explain why we don't see any mention of them for that year. also possible that some of the New Year's traditions had become so routine that people were just no longer commenting on it. Therefore, the chroniclers weren't including references to it. The following year, in 683, we again see the functionaries paying their respects. We also see the presentation of a three-legged sparrow by the viceroy of Tsukushi, Taji no Babito no Shima, along with others. A three-legged sparrow would have been quite something. It's reminiscent of the three-legged crow often depicted in the sun. And it's unclear if this was still alive at the time, but that wasn't the point. They invited the princes of the blood down to the ministers to the great hall, the Daigokuden, for a banquet where the three-legged sparrow was put on display. Later that month, Owama issued a decree in regards to all of the auspicious omens and made presents to everyone from shoken rank upwards. There was also a general amnesty. All crimes were pardoned from capital offenses on down, and all forced labor was remitted so that people didn't have to provide their normal service. Phrasing for this is rather intriguing. Owama is mentioned as Yamato Neko Sumera no Mikoto and is specifically called a god incarnate. This is one of the rare times that we see the Chronicles explicitly call out the sovereign as a living deity. Of course, they trace the royal lineage back to Amaterasu, but there isn't a lot suggesting that the sovereign is necessarily a deity most of the time. And in reality, this was probably something that was more of an honorific than anything else. Heck, at times in Japanese history, we would see sovereigns selling their calligraphy to help keep the royal palace funded, while warriors went around actually being in charge of things. However, this divine language did show up in the 19th and 20th century, especially as the Tenno, now called emperor in English terminology, once again was recognized as the head of state, and people would actually pray to him. Not necessarily like praying to a shrine, but out of respect. And remember, a lot of time the Tenno was kept out of sight of the regular people and hidden, much like the way that the kami were treated. The concept of the emperor's divinity was very much tied up in the elevation of the state and the general sense of nationalism that had gripped Japan in the early half of the 20th century. And so the Allies after World War II quite explicitly had Emperor Showa renounce his divinity. Those studying Japanese history have probably heard of this concept, so it is interesting to see evidence of it here, as well as the nature of the royal house, where the sovereign is kept at a distance from those of lower rank, unless they are directly serving him. But it was not as though the sovereign was a god in the sense of being all-powerful. Even if he were considered a living, visible kami, the kami were not omnipotent, and there's no getting over the fact that our particular sovereign, Owama, was getting on in years. Only a year or so earlier, he had suffered a rather bad illness, so he clearly was not invincible. And it is, of course, possible that this language was simply royal exaggeration rather than any attempt to define the sovereign as something more than what he was. Still, that concept would continue to play a part throughout Japanese history. That same day in 683 that Owama issued the pardons, we're told that there was a special performance at the Oharida court of dance and music from Goguryeo, Baekje, and Shilla, the three countries of the Korean peninsula, even if only one of them was actually still a going concern. The Oharida Palace is thought to have been north along the banks of the Asuka River. It may have been moved over time. There appears to have been a palace in the Furumiya area near Toyoura, but there's also evidence of a palace by a shared name over by Ikazuchi no Oka on the other side of the river. Excavations at Ikazuchi no Oka revealed pottery with the name of the palace, suggesting that this was the site, but even then that pottery was from the later Temmu era. Regardless, it seems that the Asuka Valley was just chock full of palaces, new and old, though the older ones were not as regularly used for government functions, one assumes. The following year, 684, we again get told about the annual archery shoot. It took place in the Eastern Court this time, with ministers in attendance. Apparently, they had men skilled in archery shooting alongside palace attendants and little people. The word used in Japanese is shuju or hikihito. This is often translated as dwarf. It appears to be a derogatory term for anyone considered short of stature, though it is also used to refer more generally to those seen as either lacking wit or to actors and performers. And this isn't the first time we see the term. Back in 675, about 9 years prior, Oama had sent orders to a number of regions near the capital, from Awaji to Tamba, to Omi, and to Mino and Ohari, among others, to send as tribute common people who could sing, shuju, or dwarfs, and jugglers. More generally, they seem to be referring to entertainers, and it strikes me that this could be what is meant there. Either way, the entertainment industry was hardly a lucrative one, and we can see that performers are almost more of a commodity to be paid as tribute rather than a professional who is hired to work. I suspect that, as in many other times and places, individuals who were shorter than average often found work as entertainers in this sense, whether they wished to or not. Now, the year 685, we don't see any mention of archery, though it probably still happened. Instead, the Chronicles focus on the various government officials paying their respects to the sovereign. The rest of the entries in that month are largely concerned with changes to the rank system as of that year. The year 686, we get the last records of various New Year's festivals. 4 months later, the sovereign would grow terribly ill, and he would eventually pass away later that same year. However, for those still celebrating the New Year in 686, that was all in the future. The last year of Oama's reign started out relatively like any other. Oama went to the Daigokuden, the Great Hall of Audience, and gave a banquet to the princes and high officials. There he decided to have something of a riddle challenge. He would ask riddles and offer prizes for the correct answer. And no, unfortunately, we don't have any of these riddles, at least none that I have seen. Aston calls these conundrums and notes they are specifically nonsensical questions and provides examples such as, why does a horse, after a rapid run, listen to the earth? Why does a dog, when he slowly goes, raise his leg? Now, Oama's son, Prince Takechi, answered correctly, apparently, as did Prince Issei. Their prizes differed in content, but in both cases they were pretty extensive. The winners received ceremonial robes, brocade or purple hakama, numerous bolts of coarse silk, many pounds of thread, many hundreds of pounds of floss silk, and hundreds of bolts of cloth. I think that makes it quite a bit more lucrative than any of the quiz nights I've ever been to. Now, later that month, there was another banquet, this time for 9 Buddhist monks of Daikon Daiji. Besides its status as a national temple, this may have also been related to the year before, when Oama had fallen ill and prayers had been offered at Daikon Daiji for his recovery. The court had likewise provided gifts to the temple in the last month of the previous year, and then at the banquet gave to the attending monks silk and cloth based on their priestly rank. That wasn't the end of the gifts. The following day, the princes and high officials all received upper garments and hakama, likely referring to official garments, each getting 1 suit each. Then, on the 13th day of the new year, the court invited 20 exceptional individuals to a banquet. These were talented people, professors, divination specialists, and physicians. They were also wined and dined and presented various gifts. On the 16th day, the princes and high officials were then invited to a banquet in the Daigokuden, the main audience hall. There they were given gifts of silk and cloth based on their rank. Then they held another riddle competition, with correct answers rewarded with gifts of coarse and floss silk. Apparently not quite as much as was given previously. This was only a short time after disaster had struck, though that disaster was a bit removed. 2 days earlier in the evening, the royal storehouse at Naniwa had caught fire, apparently burning the entire Toyosaki Palace complex to the ground. Some claim that the fire actually started at a private residence, that of Atono Muraji no Kusuri, and then spread to the palace. In the end, only the military storehouse was spared. This would have been quite the tragedy for the government, but it did not halt the festivities happening down in Asuka. The Naniwa Palace appears to have been a major government center for the administration of the state, but it was not the royal court, which had been in Asuka for over a decade. Indeed, I imagine that the news probably reached Asuka around the time of the banquet itself. And yet, rather than putting a damper on the festivities, they continued for another couple of days. Presumably, everything was already prepared and there was no point in canceling. On the 17th, the court sponsored a banquet in the rear palace, presumably for the queen and members of the imperial family. Then, the following day, there was a great revel at the palace. Oama took his place in front of the royal muro and made presents to performers as well as to the singers. As before, everything varied according to rank. Asuka wasn't the only place to get in on the festivities. The same month, the court also sponsored a banquet for the Shilla envoys in Tsukushi, sending Prince Kawachi and others. Regrettably, that would be the last New Year that Oama would see. In the 5th month, he grew ill, and what we see in the Chronicles after that is an interesting look into how people of the time dealt with sickness. First, the court had the Sutra of Yakshi expounded at Kawaradera and held a Buddhist retreat in the palace, inviting monks to come and expound Buddhist teachings. Yakshi, or Yakshi Nyorai, Baisajaguru in Sanskrit, was known as the medicine Buddha, and his name in Sinitic characters was basically Master of Medicine. It's said that he was responsible for the Eastern Pure Land and that, as a bodhisattva, had made 12 great vows to cure the illnesses of all living beings in the world. For that reason, Yakshi Nyorai was often called upon to cure illness. In fact, 6 years earlier, when Queen Uno no Sararahime had taken ill, Oama erected an entire temple to Yakshi Nyorai, known as Yakshiji. He then had 100 people take vows as priests, and they attributed her recovery to that effort. In this case, however, it seems that it didn't have quite such an effect, and Oama remained under the weather. We're also told that the court sent palace attendants, the Otoneri, to clean the pagodas of various temples, and that a general amnesty was announced for all under heaven, emptying out the prisons. All of this points to the idea of making merit in the hope of bringing good karma, and thus healing to the state, and the head of state, the sovereign himself. But the following month, Oama was still ill. Divination was performed by the Onmyoji, the court diviners, and they claimed that this was all caused because of a curse from Kusanagi, the sword that is considered one of the 3 main royal symbols. This is the sword that was said to have been found by Susanoo in the tale of Yamata no Orochi, and which gained its name, Kusanagi, when used by Yamato Takeru, cutting down the grass to save him when his enemies tried to catch him by setting fire to the field where he was hunting. And for more on that, go back and check out episodes 34 and 35. Given the importance of Kusanagi, I suspect that the idea of destroying it to remove the curse was just out of the question, and so it was sent to Atsuta Shrine, where it was enshrined and would largely stay, except when needed for enthronement ceremonies and the like. Yet, even after the sword was taken away, the illness still remained. So 6 days later, on the 16th day of the 6th month, the court sent Prince Issei and officials to Asuka-dera and asked the monks there to make an oath with the Buddha to make Oama whole through the power of the 3 treasures of Buddhism. For their work, the 3 Buddhist officers, the Master of the Law, and the Upadhyaya, the temple directors, as well as those monks with the rank of Master, each received a donation of 1 robe and 1 cover, or oi, or obi. 3 days later, the court ordered the 100 officials to go to Kawaradera and perform the ceremony of lighting lanterns and giving offerings to the Buddha. Then they held a great feast and offered repentance for their transgressions. All of this sounds like continued attempts to make merit for the state and, once again, for Oama. We then see the court granting monks, Honin and Gisho 30 stipend households to provide for them in their old age. Again, might just be more merit-making or possibly related to some of the many other activities so far. There are a few issues with this entry, and Aston and Bentley don't seem to agree on the actual date. Bentley has it on the 28th, but that seems odd as it comes before the entry for the 22nd of the same month. Aston has it at the 20th, but then claims that there's something odd about the date of the 22nd. On the 22nd, we are simply told that the district kitchen of Nabari caught fire. Aston notes that this would have been the official government arm in the district for gathering food to supply to the royal household, rather than being a kitchen in terms of a place to prepare food for immediate eating. Merit making continued into the 7th month. We see the Sojo and Soju, the primary and secondary prelates of Asuka-dera, performing ritual repentance. The following day, there is another general amnesty, and Aston specifically mentions performing an oharai, or cleansing ritual. The day after that, taxes were halved from the provinces and corvée labor with local conscripted labor was exempted for the year. Then we see the court presenting paper offerings to the Kunikasukami in Ki province, as well as the 4 shrines in Asuka and the great Suminoe, aka Sumiyoshi Shrine. On the 8th day of the 7th month, 100 monks were invited to the court to read the Golden Light Sutra, Konko Myokyo, and on the 15th there was another court-issued amnesty. Despite all of these attempts to make merit and intercede with the Buddha or with various kami, Owama's illness continued. We see that the court issued a decree that all things that should occur, great or small, should be reported to the queen and the crown prince, presumably because Owama was no longer in a state to be able to do so. Continuing with their efforts, the court declared that destitute commoners who had been forced to borrow rice seed or money before the 12th month of the previous year, they'd be exempted from repayment. And then the court changed the name of the year to Akamitori or Shucho. They also renamed the palace in Asuka to Kiyomihara. Again, go check episode 134 for more on that palace. Shucho is the red bird, likely referring to Suzaku, though Aston also points out that Asuka here is given as flying bird in Sinitic characters as well, and there had been numerous bird-related omens reported throughout the reign. Although these names would not have been used prior to this point, the 7th month of the final year of the reign, the chroniclers applied the Nengo Shucho to all of the entries for this year, and the name of the palace is often given as Kiyomihara to distinguish it from the later Okamoto Palace, even though it was simply the latter palace with the addition of the Ebinoko enclosure. The changing of the era name was likely another attempt to change the seemingly inauspicious year, along with all of the merit-making that the court had been undergoing. Yet they kept going at it, trying, hoping that something would work. So the court selected 70 people who were diligent in keeping Buddhist laws, had them take the tonsure. Then they sponsored a feast or festival in the royal muro of the palace. At the same time, the various princes had a statue of the Bodhisattva of Compassion, Kannon, made for the sovereign and had the Lotus Sutra, the sutra where Kannon is first mentioned, read out at Daikon Daiji. Kannon, or Avalokitesvara, was originally seen as a male bodhisattva, but is often depicted as a woman. They are also known as Guanyin, from which we get Kannon in Japanese. Guanyin is also seen as the goddess of mercy and is one of the most popular figures across multiple sects of Buddhism and even outside of the Buddhist faith, where she is still seen as a goddess. In this case, however, it seems clear that the princes were seeking compassion to relieve the sovereign of his affliction. Yet, the disease persisted. They had 80 more people take the tonsure, and then 100 more men and women placed 100 statues of the Bodhisattva Kannon in the palace, and then read out 200 volumes of the Lotus Sutra. Then they made prayers to the kami of heaven and earth, and they dispatched Hatano Imiki no Iwakatsu to present paper offerings to the Tosa Great Shrine. Just nothing seemed to be working. In the 9th month, we see the royal princes and others, down to the various ministers, all gathered at Kawaradera, making oaths for the health of the sovereign. This last-ditch effort would still go unrewarded. 5 days later, Owama would pass away. Of course, they couldn't just say that he died. The Chronicles actually say that he divinely departed. After all, didn't they just call him an incarnate kami? 2 days later, the court began the ritual of mourning, raising voices in lamentation and setting up a temporary palace of internment in the courtyard south of the palace. Owama's body was placed there some 13 days later, and people mourned his passing. For the rituals, we see monks and nuns performing ritual lamentation in the courtyard between 3 and 5 a.m., around the time that court officials would normally be waiting at the gates. Over the next several days, various ceremonies were held and eulogies given. We're told that the court presented offerings of food for the dead for the very first time, and over the next several days, monks and nuns would offer their laments, and then various individuals would provide their eulogies. Finally, on the last day of the 9th month, eulogies were concluded with Nyang-u, a Baekje prince, who pronounced a eulogy on behalf of his father, and then the Miyatsuko of various provinces came and did likewise. There were also performances of all manner of singing and dancing. With that, the reign of Owama, aka Temmu Tenno, would come to an end. The government would continue under his wife, the queen, and the crown prince. We'll get into the succession in a later episode. For now, I'll just say that he was eventually buried in a large tomb in the modern Noguchi area of Asuka. You can still go visit it today. While that does bring us to the end of the reign, we still have a few more things I want to discuss. This episode just seemed a good time to talk about all the various New Year ceremonies, and that seemed to lead naturally into the very last year, but there's still more to discuss about what happened during this reign. For one thing, we still haven't covered the spread of Buddhism and the changes in the Buddhist structure. There are also various laws and punishments that are worth covering, if just to see how the Ritsuryo was put into effect. Finally, there are the Chronicles themselves. We've talked about it all along, but the very origins of the Nihon Shoki and the Kojiki are attributed to this era, as was the start of what would become the capital of Fujiwara Kyo. Many works that Oama would not live to see to the end, but is largely held responsible for starting. But we're going to stop here for now. And so, until then, if you like what we're doing, please tell your friends and feel free to rate us wherever you listen to podcasts. If you feel the need to do more and want to help us keep this thing going, we have information on how you can donate on Patreon or through our coffee site, ko-fi.com/sengokudaimyo, or find links over at our main website, sengokudaimyo.com/podcast, where we will have some more discussion on topics from this episode. Also, feel free to reach out to our Sengoku Daimyo Facebook page, and you can email us at thesengokudaimyo@gmail.com. Thank you also to Ellen for their work editing the podcast. And that's all for now. Thank you once again, and I'll see you next episode on Sengoku Daimyo's Chronicles of Japan.